and you, and the responsibilities of the states. The states. So it's the states that have the duties in respecting the rights of the individuals. And you know the right to life, liberty, freedom of thought and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of movement, freedom from discrimination, torture, etc. These are all human rights. You know them. What I think is important to stress is the ethical values behind human rights, the ethical foundation. And the ethical values is human dignity and equality. We have all the same human dignity, and in that way we are equal. And then, of course, we should all have the same rights, independent of the color of the skin, sex, nationality, religious, ethnic background, etc. And I like this one very much. We are all different, but we are all equal. It's not wrong to be different. It's wrong to be treated differently if you are. The modern concept of human rights is closely connected to the establishment of the United Nations in 1945. When we talk about the international human rights, we are talking about the rights that were established in connection with the establishment of the United Nations. And in June 1945, in the aftermath of the Second World War, state leaders from all over the world gathered in San Francisco in a conference to discuss the mandate of this new global organization. What should be the mandate of the United Nations? And in these 6 weeks, there were coming out reports, pictures, films from a war-ridden world. The cities in Europe totally ruined, and of course the concentration camps, the Holocaust. And there were established a pressure towards these state leaders that they must include human rights as a very important issue, subject for this new organization. So human rights are mentioned several times in the United Nations Charter. But during those 6 weeks in San Francisco, the world leaders didn't have the time to go in depth into the concept of human rights. What should really be how should human rights be defined? And they put, therefore, down this Human Rights Commission, a working group consisting of eight state representatives from all over the world. And their task was to define human rights in an international Bill of Rights. And Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the Human Rights Commission, widow after the late President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And, you know, there are so much talk about today that human rights are not universal, they are a Western concept. And then I think it's interesting to inform you which state was in this Human Rights Commission that sat for 2 years and worked and defined human rights. It was Australia, Belgium, the Belarusian Soviet Republic, Chile, China, Egypt, France, India, Iran, Lebanon, Panama, the Republic of the Philippines, Great Britain, the United States of America, the Soviet Union, Uruguay, and Yugoslavia. This was the representatives in the Human Rights Commission. Can you see one continent that is poorly represented?
Well, not a continent, but a cultural area. The Maghreb wasn't well represented. The Maghreb, the north of Africa.
Yes, yes.
And that is Arab culture wasn't good, wasn't represented at all. Lebanon.
Egypt is there.
Yeah.
Egypt is there.
Sub-Saharan Africa.
Sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah. Africa was poorly represented.
West Africa, yes.
It's just Egypt in Africa. So, it has, of course, to do with the colonization.
At the time, most African countries, unfortunately, were still colonies of the empires.
That's the reason. That's the reason. But still, it's a global representation into this commission. And the question was, does it exist, the universal ethics? Could they agree on the content of human rights? And they worked and worked and worked. It was hard work for 2 years, and the process was full of challenges. Could representatives from different states, cultures, and religions agree on the content of human rights? But from the very first moment, the Commission challenged the idea that human rights was a Western concept. So the Commission asked UNESCO to interview representatives from all great civilizations and religions about their opinion on what should be included, their opinion about what is the common good. Gandhi was one person that answered the question, and this was also a theoretical fundament for the work in the Human Rights Commission. And the Commission was convinced that it was possible to agree on universal human rights that could be supported by all the states. Because they knew that if this document should be the powerful tool that they wanted it to be, it needed to have support, a universal support. That was so important to them. So, I will say a little bit about this negotiation process.
Please, could you show the
for again?
The last, yes. Okay.
You can have it afterwards. And all these things that I'm going to say to you now is in this book by Johannes Morsink, is an American professor that has gone in depth into this negotiation process, and it's very, very interesting book. I will put it here so you can look at it later on. The Human Rights Commission knew that they had to have a working process that included all the states and representatives from all over the world. First, they sat down a steering group of just 3. But then, it was especially the Soviet Union who said that this document is going to be a very important document. It cannot just be, written by 3 persons alone. We have to have a steering group of 8 states representatives. So we have the steering group of China, Australia, Chile, USA, France, Soviet Union, Lebanon, and Great Britain. They worked all the time and with the Secretariat for the Human Rights Commission. And the 38 other UN states at that point could express their minds at every moment in the process. They were sent proposals on hearings. I know that, for example, the Norwegian government, they answered and they wanted to have their input into this process. Also NGOs, Red Cross, Red Crescent Movement, Women's Group, and also individuals had the opportunity to give their opinions. And it was a complex and long process. There were 85 plenary meetings where all the states sat together in the United Nations Third Committee and 29 subcommittee meetings. It's just to underline really that this was a very long process. And I will give you one very interesting example on how they negotiated. I like this example very much. The first article, the very first article, important article in the declaration. The steering group came up with this suggestion, that Article 1 should sound like this. All men are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed by nature with reason and conscience and should act towards one another like brothers. wrong with this?
It's only
word?
gender
Gender.
bias.
The gender bias is only men. Yeah. And then there was this female representatives in the Human Rights Commission from India, Hans Salmeta, together with the Danish Bodil Bektud, who was the chair of the United Nations Women Committee at that time. They said, no, it cannot be just men. What about the women? But you know, the Human Rights Commission, it took some time, but after some months, the arguments were, you know, and so it was changed to so all men were taken out, and we had all human beings putting in instead, and like brothers were changed to in a spirit of brotherhood. It's a little bit better. A little bit better.
Well, you see, you have to put the things in the historical context. The word sisterhood is only a word created in the 60s.
Yeah, that's correct, of course. But what do you think about religion? What do you think about the issue of religion, God, etc.? What do you think the Human Rights Commission dealt with that big issue? Huh? Leave it out, yeah. You know, the Human Rights Commission wanted to leave it out. They knew that if they were going into that big question about religion, God, Allah, atheism, etc., then they would really have problems. So they tried to put it out. It was not a part of this declaration before, in the very end, when they had plenary meetings in the United Nations where all states were represented. But then, of course, this issue came up. So it was Brazil and the Netherlands that wanted to put into one sentence in Article 1, like this. They wanted to say that created in the image and likeness of God, all human beings are endowed with reason and conscience, etc. That was their suggestion. And what do you think happened with that suggestion?
Rejected.
It was rejected. It was discussed so much, and it was not formally put on the table even. So, but while they were discussing this first article, the Soviet Union, who should be a secular society, they didn't even like the term by nature. What is by nature? It's also a little bit religious, you know? Get it out. And the Soviet representatives were heard. So, in the end, the words by nature was also taken out. So now, the result was Article 1, all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I like this story about this Article 1 because it shows really that the Universal Declaration is the result of negotiations among representatives from different states, religions all over the world. It was a global process. And all these 30 articles in the Universal Declaration was discussed like Article 1. I will mention a couple of other interesting, well, before there is one associate professor in the Norwegian Center for Human Rights called Tore Lindholm. He also has been studying this process on Article 1. And he concludes like this. Article 1, the very fundamental and cornerstone of the Declaration, gives a thin normative basis where representatives of many religions, moral tradition and ideologies manage to create not only a political compromise, but a stable moral agreement on the content on human rights. And what is important is that the Universal Declaration, as well as all other UN documents on human rights, are secular documents.
My point of view is that is because of Soviet Union and of the Second World War. After Second World War, Soviet Union became a powerful, so it was in a position to have its vice, secular vice, ethical.
Yeah. And the Soviet representative was very active during this process. He's called Bogomolov, I think. But I will mention a couple of other interesting articles. Article 3, everyone has the right to life. It was also interesting discussions because Chile, a religious society, Catholicism, wanted to underline that life begins at fertilization, inside the stomach of the women. But it was turned down because the Danish and others pointed to the fact that abortion was legal in many countries. If they put into this wording into the declaration, it would not get universal support, so they couldn't do it. And the Soviet Union wanted to prohibit death penalty. Because they said, well, it's right to life. Then we have to abolish death penalty, prohibit death penalty. But of course was turned down. Because, you know, there were so many countries that really used death penalty and still are today.
It is interesting because in the Soviet Union, the state murdered thousands of people but under legal arguments.
So, but you know, so his motivation for putting this suggestion, you know, it can be discussed.
That was the very initial stage after the Second World War. So after when they became the Soviet Union, Stalinism became more powerful, then they started killing the people. But at that time, it was the first, Second World War, so it had so many effects on the world.
Yesterday, I thought, I went and read on this book, and what were the discussions about Article 18, our article. And the article is read now in the Universal Declaration. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or believe in teaching, practice, worship and observance. As I told you, the drafters, the Human Rights Committee, wanted to leave references to God and divine power outside. So they were really radical thinking. They were radical thinkers at that time. They knew that to get universal support, they couldn't go into these questions. So it was a very progressive approach, since many states at that time had majority or state-supported religions. But there were Muslim states, Muslim representatives that wouldn't have the word change. They didn't want to give people opportunity to change their religion.
Because it is prohibited in Islam to change the religion, and if one person changes his religion or religion, so he will be given death penalty.
Yes, and that's why the Muslim countries protested against this wording, but they were not heard. And the protest was not maybe that hard, because they knew also that it's very important to have universal support for this declaration. Johannes Mursink, that went into that really have studied this process, he concludes, and I want to repeat his word, because in this book he says, he says about the relationship between religion and politics. There is no presumption in the declaration that the morality of human rights requires any form of religious foundation. The drafters went out of their way to avoid having the declaration make a reference to God or man's divine origin. Most groups and nations that see an intimate connection between religion and the machinery of the state do so because they think that religion is needed to provide the moral cement that holds a nation together. The Universal Declaration rejects this connection and gives everyone total freedom of religion, including the right not to have one. I think that I wanted to just to repeat it for you. I thought it was interesting. Okay, the Universal Declaration was adopted on the 10th of November 1948. The Human Rights Day.
In December.
Yeah, December. And no states voted against it. But 8 states didn't vote. And can you guess, it's important that they didn't vote against it, but they had blank votes, so to say. Can you guess which states didn't want to who voted blank? Why? Why do you think? Because you are right. So Saudi Arabia didn't vote. Why do you think they didn't vote for it?
Yeah, I think also maybe because of the provision of the category.
Yes. They couldn't accept that people could change their religion in Article 18. And in Article, I think it's 16, about marriage, they could not accept that one could marry any persons from every religion or belief. Because a Muslim, isn't it like that? As a Muslim girl had to marry
a man can marry, but a woman cannot marry.
Yes. So that was the reason why Saudi Arabia didn't vote for the declaration. But there are some other states that didn't.
That will be my mistake. Pakistan will be there.
No, Pakistan voted for. It was South Africa, who had this apartheid regime. They couldn't go into this, really. So they sustained from voting.
Apartheid, what? Because of apartheid.
Yeah, apartheid. And it was the Soviet bloc. And that is interesting because the Soviet representatives were so participated all the time in this process, but in the end, they didn't vote for. It was the six countries from the Soviet bloc.
3 years was the Stalinism.
Yeah.
So
Often it is assumed that it has to do with that they didn't accept the political and civil rights. But Johannes Marsing said it's not like that. They couldn't, they didn't like the economy, where there was seen that the state was in opposition to the population.
yes.
Because the Communist Party should be represent the whole population. And they also wanted to include prohibition of Nazism and fascism. But the Human Rights Commission couldn't go into that because it should really be a document without reference to ideologies. So that's the reasons why the Soviet bloc sustained from war. The Universal Declaration, I have it here. I think it, so I just, you can just have it because I think it's a fantastic document and it's a really radical document. It was at that time and it is today. And how was it possible? How was it possible that the Human Rights Commission and representatives from all over the world really could agree on the content of human rights and make such a radical document? It has, of course, to do with the World War II, the Second World War, Europe in ruins, a global war, 50 million dead. It was a horrible, horrible times. And before the Second World War, we had the Depression period, and then we had the First World War. So there were really 30 years in the international community with war and anarchy. So there were these activistic sense of initiative in the international community. They really wanted to make a new world. They really wanted to make a new world, and they understood that human rights should be could be a guarantee for a peaceful future.
Well, yes, was it the failure also of democracy to protect people? The fact that in Germany Hitler was democratically elected, and that the risk of a majority tyrannizing minorities, and that this was protection?
Of course. You have a Germany, a democratic Germany, that made Nuremberg laws, that really institutionalized discrimination, that made Jews and other groups in the society on not equal footing. Concentration camps, who were really the state discrimination, and they understood that it is so important that we need to make common rule for all the states on how they shall treat their own citizens.
And it's being undermined right now. People are forgetting that throughout Europe, it's beginning to be undermined.
Yeah, and that's why I say it was really a radical document, and it still is. And because for the first time in the history of mankind, there were universal laws on how each state should treat its inhabitants. And 30 articles, you have got it now. And what is so important to underline again is the ethical fundamentals. The way we see individual human beings. We have all the same human dignity. And that's why we are equal. And that's why we have the non-discrimination principle, which lies in the core of the human rights system. And Johannes Morsing says in this book that it was the World War II and the moral shock gave the Commission a common platform to operate and work from. And Bernd Hogtvedt, professor of political science in Norway, said it was really a lucky moment in history, because shortly after the Cold War set in, and might, could have destroyed the common feeling of idealistic activism in the society. So, I like this phrase. It was a lucky moment in history.
A short window of...
A short window of opportunity.
Yes.
And they took it, and they knew they had this opportunity.
Yes.
So, I like to tell this story about how the Universal Declaration came into being, because it says so much about the nature of human rights. So, I believe that the Universal Declaration, and many with me, is the most important UN document ever. And it became the starting point for the international human rights system that has developed after 1948. Other declarations, other human rights declarations, other juridical binding conventions, the whole UN human rights system, and regional human rights systems. That still is developing. And it's so important to really strengthen also the regional human rights systems that is now coming to. I used to say that the Universal Declaration is a child of its time, because it has to be understood in its time. But it is also a child before its time, because we are still struggling. Because we still have problems with this. Human dignity, equality, the non-discrimination principle. We have still problems with this. I must go on. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights is a political and moral document.
Yes.
It is
And
very
it is different from other conventions.
Yes. It is very, it was a very, it's a very important document. The Human Rights Commission, a long time, they thought that they should make a convention. But it was the United States of America and the Soviet Union that in the end said, no, we cannot make a convention, a declaration is okay. But the Human Rights Commission was not satisfied with the Universal Declaration just being a declaration. So they continued their work. But it took 18 years because of the Cold War. It took 18 years before the Human Rights Commission had developed and written a covenant on civil and political rights and a covenant on economical, social and cultural rights, which can be said is the twin conventions to the Universal Declaration. And it is very, very important that you understand the difference between a declaration and a convention. Because human rights conventions are legally binding for the states that ratify them. I say they sign in a special procedure and say that, okay, this human rights convention, we want to make it national law. So national law must harmonize with obligations in the conventions, and the states also must report to the United Nations, often every 4 or 5 years. And often the states must accept visits from the United Nations, that special rapporteurs and others can come and visit the country and see how is this implementation going on.
But but that thing, if it did not become a convention which is very fruitful and beneficial for the entire humanity, because now Declaration on Human Rights, that is a general law for the entire humanity. And the conventions that are, some states say no, we are accepting this one and not this one, and we have objection on that. But now no one can say that we have objection on Universal Declaration.
Johannes Morsink said afterwards, in the years after, and even now, it might be lucky that the declaration was just a declaration, because it has in a way an independent moral status as the mother document on all human rights documents, and not implementation mechanisms connected to it that might fail. Okay, I have some more. I must just continue. The legally binding conventions. The texts in the conventions are more precise often and more clearly defined than in the declarations. And the conventions often express that the rights can be subject to limitations. But only if it is prescribed by law, is necessary in a democratic society for the sake of national security, for protecting public safety, order, health or morals, or for protecting the rights and freedoms of others. This is, of course, because when states ratify conventions, they must implement the obligations in reasonable time. And I will mention the most important United Nations conventions to you. It is the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights from 1966, Convention Against Racial Discrimination, Convention Against Discrimination of Women, Convention Against Torture, Convention on the Rights of the Child, and now the latest one, Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities.
Now it is the latest.
And we have also the Convention for Refugees, I can mention. These are the most important United Nations conventions. I want to make, I want to say one more thing about this. States have a possibility to make reservations when they ratify conventions. And that is a little bit problematic because conventions are often very long with many, many articles. And some states might have a problem with some of the articles. And the system functions like that the states then can make reservations if they do not accept some of the articles.
And also there was some, we say that conflict with religion. They also say yes.
Yes.
In my country, on the child rights, they when they were signing it, and so they said yes, we will do it, but we will see that if there is some conflict between Islam and these rights, so we will not do it.
Yes, and that's the problem. Yes. For many, this is really a problem. And often, states make reservations just because that the human rights collide with culture and tradition. But why do you think the United Nations allow this?
I understand also Islam has also come out with the Universal Declaration of Islam. Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
No, Universal
Islamic
Declaration.
Universal Declaration of
Human Rights under Islam.
Islam. No, Universal Declaration of
No.
Special on Islam.
Yes. You are talking about the Cairo Declaration. Yes. I'll come to that later on. Okay.
Yeah, there's a special one declaration.
Yes.
And accepted at the United Nations.
Yeah. I will come to that because, you know, the international human rights system is so complex, it's so huge. I can just touch on some issues here, but I will mention that shortly afterwards, okay? But the United Nations allow states to make reservations because it's a thinking that it's better to have the states inside the system than to have them outside. Yes, it's better to have them inside so we can talk with them, we can have dialogue with them, and maybe they can move in the right direction.
Is it a staged procedure? Again, you ratify to begin with. The idea is that you are indicating your general intention to sign, but you may have reservations to sign.
Yeah.
Sign first before.
Sorry, you sign.
Yeah, you sign, and then, but the important thing is the ratification. When the state ratify, then you are obliged. And yes, and in that ratification process, you might make reservation. But these reservations should be very specific reservations. But we see that often states can make very general reservations. And I will give you one example on that. Because Saudi Arabia has in fact ratified the Women Convention, but still they do not allow voting rights for women. So how is this possible, huh? How is this possible? And it's possible because they have made a very general reservation. And the reservation is like this. In case of contradiction between any term of the convention and the norms of Islamic law, the kingdom, Saudi Arabia, is not under obligation to observe the contradictory terms of the convention. So this is a way that some states that are not very good human rights states still can be a part of this human rights system, and they can still ratify human rights convention. I think this is a very important point that you should have in mind when I give you also the next statistics, because I I think this statistic is very important. This is facts, you know?
Yes.
And this is the status for ratification of UN Human Rights Convention, the most important UN Human Rights Convention, from a period from 1991, 2000, 2004, and 2011, because yesterday I was in and checked these numbers. And this is the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. This is the Convention on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. This is the Convention against Torture, Convention against Racial Discrimination, Convention against Women's Rights and Children's Rights. And in 1991, there were 56% of all states that had ratified the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And then, by the years, the number increases, and today it's about 86%.
And this was
almost all states in the world today have ratified the Convention on Civil and Political Rights.
Is that in full or with reservations?
Is with reservations. But still, you can see a very clear movement in a positive direction. And social, economic, and cultural rights, you have the same pattern. 58% in 1991. Today, 84%. Convention against torture, 36% in 1991, 77 today. Convention against racial discrimination, 72 in 1991 and 91% today. And Convention on Women's Rights, 62% in 1991, up to 187 states today, 97%. And the convention, which is most supported by the states, are the Convention on the Rights of the Child, with 99%. There are 2 states that have not ratified this convention. It's the United States of America and it's Somalia.
Because they say, United States says that we give more rights than this convention, therefore we are not bound to it.
Yeah.
So this is their proper.
Yeah. Okay, I must continue. I'm getting out of time here. Okay?
I just believe that the convention to do with the children is because the big states puts in the mechanisms to apply, because usually the small states usually shove off some of those conventions unless there are some strategies from up, especially like the UN mechanisms regarding the convention regarding the children.
Yeah. I will go on now to talk a little bit on which implementation mechanisms that do exist.
Yes.
It's impossible to go in depth into this, but I will just mention some very important mechanisms. And it is the United Nations committees, the UN committees. Because when states ratify conventions, they must report each 4 or 5 years to the UN on how they implement their obligations. And NGOs can make shadow reports on how the situation is. You as humanists, you can write shadow reports when your state is reporting to the United Nations Human Rights Committee on how they implement civil and political rights. And these committees consist of 15 to 18 experts who evaluate the state's reports and give recommendations, criticize, or point to possible changes. These are called, the United Nations committees are called treaty-based mechanisms because they are fundamented in the conventions. When you read the convention, you can say that there will be established a committee. This is a picture from the Women Committee, and what is very important is that this is open hearings in the United Nations. So when Norway, for example, have written its report to the UN Human Rights Committee, they must go to this committee attend the hearing, and other states can comment. The UN committee makes comments, and also representatives from NGOs can be present and
they are
make
observers,
comments.
but they are observers. NGOs represent civil societies, representatives are observers. Observers.
Observers, yes.
Because they have just sitting there.
Yeah. So I think everything is on the web. These reports are on the web. So these are open hearings between the United Nations committees and the states. And it's possible for you to go in and read, make comment, etc.
I think this is a very, very important point when we are considering how you can use the UN system and human rights in your work. Because no states likes it when members of their citizenry report them to the UN. So for that reason, to write what Linda is calling shadow reports is very important. And this is something that you can do in cooperation with other NGOs, and should be done in cooperation with other NGOs, because it gives greater weight to your findings, to your criticism. This is a very important work. It cannot be emphasized enough, because this is one of the mechanisms where you can use actively human rights in promoting humanist values.
I will come back to that, Lars, because it's very, very important. It's a concrete tool for you. I'm sorry, I just have to hurry up a little bit. I will just mention these human rights committees that you should know about. When it comes to the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, it's the Human Rights Committee. It's called UN Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, it's Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. UN Convention Against Racial Discrimination, Committee Against Racial Discrimination. The UN Women Committee, Committee Against Torture, the Children's Committee, and Committee on the Rights of the Disabled People. These are experts that are reading the reports from the states, the shadow reports, and analyze it, make recommendations, criticize, give positive points back to the states. And the press is, of course, also important. They can make news about these processes. I think I will